Pro 777 Radio. This is episode 237. Jason Lingerud is with me and Tom Barnett from the Land Down Under. We're going to talk a little bit about legal ideas. We've been meeting any number of people from Australia. So many people learning the law, knowing the law, and implementing the law, trying to get back to a world that's common sense, if that's possible at this point. Anyhow, welcome, Jason.
And this is one of those rare occasions when I get to say, good evening, Crow.
I think we should just get them in and let's jump right in here. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me on.
If I'm not mistaken, you use your full name online. Is that correct?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, well, we referred to you. I think it was Dr. Berlando, actually, who hooked us up together. He's followed what we've done, and we were happy to meet you. I think we're going to roll onto your bullet points just as they are. So you want to kick off at commerce?
Sure. Yeah. Well, depending on what stage people are at, whether they're just coming around to learning about their rights in the law, or whether they've, been at it for a few years or they've had a lot of successes, I think it's important for people to realize that what we come under all of the time is commerce. So when we're dealing with law, we're not necessarily dealing with statutes and codes and color of law. We're dealing with commerce, and commerce is just how we act in the world of buying and selling. So most people, if asked if they ever buy or sell, everybody would say, yes, of course, I buy and sell all the time. And so we're always involved in the act of commerce. So what's important to do is start to understand what codes and maxims, I guess, govern commerce, and where you stand, what realms are in there, and where the roles are, whether you're a debtor or a creditor, and just finding out a bit more about the language involved, so that you're not inadvertently putting yourself in the role of a debtor, and you can maintain your role as a creditor when we're dealing in commerce.
So is the contention here that just to live in the modern age, you're always involved in commerce? Is that what you're laying down, or are there times when you're definitely not involved in commerce?
Well, that depends on how much you know about it and whether you are choosing to participate or not, because commerce requires your consent and commerce requires agreements or contracts. So if you know how to use your own language, the right language, and then you're not inadvertently getting yourself into agreements that you are unknowingly entering into, or turning an agreement into a contract by way usually of consideration, which means payment. So then besides those two, with your own, I guess, use of language, you can withdraw yourself from commerce. But generally speaking, everything, every spoken word, every agreement, it all comes under commerce.
Last go. Can I read the harm principle to you? This is out of the Australian Oxford Law Dictionary.
No, it's just out of register.
Only just out for 5 days. Yeah. The principle espoused by J.S. Mill on Liberty, 1859, that state law is legitimate if its purpose is to stop a person from harming another. Beyond this, it becomes illegitimate and it infringes the individual's right to freedom of action. Did you get that?
Yeah, I did. But Lucas, do you understand that obviously we've confirmed your ID and we've explained how you've done the right thing there? We've now...
What's important is to know when and where and how you can either refrain from entering into commercial agreements or reserve your rights going in so that it's not held against you.
Can we give an example or two of commerce in our daily lives that maybe a lot of folks won't realize? It is indeed commerce.
Sure. So anytime that there is anything offered. So a simple example is if I was a contractor, I was a builder or a plumber or a painter, I might come to your home, or I might give you a call, or you'd call me. And what I would do is I would offer my services. I would say, I can do this service for you. It will cost this amount of money, and these are my terms and conditions. Would you like to go ahead, essentially? And you as a client, potential client or customer, have the right to, first of all, agree or disagree, to not consent to entering into that. You also have the ability to negotiate. You could say, well, I don't like these terms and conditions, but if we change this one and this one, then I'm in. So you have the right to either refuse honorably, you have the right to conditionally accept, you have the right to negotiate. So how that applies to modern daily life is that you might be offered, for example, a tax bill, or you might be offered to wear a mask in public, or you might be offered to take a vaccine. You might be offered to pay a fine for not doing any of the above. So in that regard, if you come at it from the idea that it is an offer to enter into commerce or to contract, then you have the right to conditionally accept, which is honorable. You can fully accept, which is honorable. If you outright refuse or you remain silent, in the world of commerce, that's dishonorable, and you enter into the realm of being dishonorable, which is not favorable when we're dealing with commerce. So to clarify that, if you are offered a fine or you're offered to have to get a vaccine or whatever it might be, then you can, to remain in honor, my favorite way is to conditionally accept. So if you were to offer that to me, I would say, well, I'll conditionally accept your offer to get a vaccine or to pay $1,000 fine for not wearing a mask or whatever it might be. And then I would say, on the condition that you can provide for me your source of authority to either make me do this or to issue a fine, and that you can satisfy points 1 to say 3 or 4. And if you can satisfy these, then I will most definitely take up your offer to receive a vaccination or to pay this alleged debt that you're offering me. So by doing that, I am remaining honorable in commerce, and it is then up to you to provide your proof of claim. And if you cannot provide that, then there is no agreement, and the commercial outcome or win is in my favor in that way under commerce.
Let's ask a couple questions here. So can this portion be done? Does it have to be done in writing? Can it be done verbally? I mean, you're going to find yourself in a lot of positions where stopping to try to write these things down and submit it seems a bit tedious. But I guess if that was the way, that's the way. Can it be done orally?
Yeah, it can. Yeah. So the ways that you can contract or agree or whatever is that you can do it verbally. You can sign something. It can be in writing, and or you can make a payment. If you offer to me to pay a fine and I pay it, I make that agreement. I forge that agreement and it's done. And I do that via giving payment. I can sign something to agree. And yeah, as you've said, which is a great point, I can verbally agree. So if you are offered with these, offers in public, for example, and somebody is speaking them to you, yes, you can 100% do this verbally as well. You can conditionally accept, you can ask for proof of claim, you can ask for evidence, you can ask for a source of authority. And if they don't provide those, the most important part about commerce is the idea of holding your position, because a lot of people, especially nowadays, they can either play dumb, or if you're dealing with somebody lower level and they're just on minimum wage, they may have no idea of what you're talking about. So in that regard, you need to push a little further. You need to let them know that you may counterclaim against them and get their indemnity insurer involved, because anybody working in a public capacity, which is anybody that's going to offer you some kind of commercial offer, are working in a public capacity. So they need to hold public and just indemnity insurance, various types. So that just means that if they do anything that goes against their code of conduct, whether they're aware of their own code of conduct or not, it can go as a complaint to their indemnity insurer, and that can mean, first of all, them getting fired, and then second of all, you receiving a settlement because of breach of conduct.
So there are a couple of things. I'm guessing that a lot of people are going to have a phone in their hand and they're going to record these things, which would probably deal with a lot of the issues. But I mean, that means you're going to make some kind of a court claim, doesn't it? If you try to do the best you can, everything goes south, and I don't know, what's it called, a breach or whatever, the rules have been broken, for you to follow on, you would have to go to court, wouldn't you?
Well, it's also established that a court is indeed a place where commerce transpires, is it not?
It is, yeah. A courtroom is simply, it's a business. In the States, I think all the judges are paid by the Port Authority. In Australia, they're essentially Masonic temples. So they're all there just to provide money for the court system. So so first of all, yes, they are 100% just dealing with commerce. Second of all, though, we have the two different realms. We have the private realm and the public realm. So when I'm dealing with people in the public, I always bring them round to becoming a player in the world of the private, which means that courts aren't necessary until perhaps a final step. But just to back up a few steps, and then I'll get to that. I'll get around to answering that one. Having a phone or some kind of recording device definitely works in your favor for two reasons. One is that people don't like being recorded. Once they know they're being recorded, they're less likely to actually outwardly tell lies because they're being recorded doing it. And second of all is that it's your witness. So you can either have somebody witnessing, you could have a friend with you, you could have anybody. And if you end up getting into some kind of commercial verbal stoush with anybody in the public, you can have your friend or whoever's with you, you can just say, hey, look, would you witness that? Would you sign an affidavit to say that this person here has made these claims? And they'll say yes. And then that's your proof of, that's your second witness right there. If you don't have that, you do need to record it, because when we're dealing with anything legal, hearsay is not evidence. Only evidence, actually, only what's on record is able to pass as evidence. So you need a recording, essentially. You can't just walk in and say, oh, they said this and they said that. And they'll say, well, where's your evidence? And if you can't provide it, then whatever you've said just is not admissible in a court, for example. So to avoid getting to court, what we do is we engage people in what's called a private administration process. And that means noticing them directly. You can verbally notice them, but generally it's best to, the first step is to verbally notice. For example, if we're having a conversation and you're saying that I'm supposed to get a vaccine, wear a mask, pay a fine, whatever, I'll say, well, look, I'm happy to do that as long as you actually have the authority to do so. Can you provide me with your source of authority to do that? Now, when they can't, that's when you say, well, look, I'm noticing you that if you cannot provide evidence and you cannot provide a source of authority, I'm going to counterclaim you and I'm going to sue you. So what you're doing then is, by way of actually saying the word notice, that I'm noticing you, then that puts them on notice.
Let me jump in real quick. What would be a legitimate, in the situation you laid down, what would be an acceptable, legitimate authority that could be proffered by someone making this offer?
Well, the thing is it doesn't exist. So a lot of people claim to have authority. So anybody, I guess we'll back up just for a really basic premise to, an umbrella for everything that we'll talk about today, is that there are two worlds and two realms that we can exist in. We have the private realm, as I've mentioned, and the public realm. Now, the difference between the two is that the private is the world of the living, the public is the world of the dead. So private is substance and public is fiction. The reason that they can be hard to get your head around, or you may not have heard of one or the other, is that one is a mirror image of the other. So in the world of the private, we have, that's the world of the living and the world of substance. So in the world of the private, we have men and women. In the world of the public, which is the mirror image, but it's the world of the non-living and fiction, we have persons. And what you'll find is that any code or statute or act that is written about us, supposedly about us, it is written about persons. Any persons not wearing a mask, any persons that want to travel need to get a vaccine, any persons. A person in a legal dictionary is an entity. It is, it's fiction. It's like a trustee in bankruptcy, a resident, a ratepayer, a taxpayer, a driver, a citizen. All these are statutory terms. So all of these codes, acts, statutes, and color of law, they apply to creatures of statute, which are non-living entities. That's what's made up. That's what your name is, essentially. So the man and the woman, which exist in the private, are given inherent rights. We have inalienable rights, and we're actually given dominion, because all of the laws come from the Bible, and men and women are given dominion. That's superior to rights. But for the purpose of what we're talking about, rights are still superior to anything else. So what the complementary or mirror image of rights, which exist in the private, in the public, the mirror image are benefits and privileges. And essentially, a ward of the state is, or a slave is given benefits and privileges. They do not have rights. A slave does not have rights. So in order to make your standing as somebody in the private, you can use a second witness principle. So in Australia, we do this. I know that guys in America do this too. And that is to ask somebody, for example, in a courtroom, we would say, so look, your source of authority, what is that, by the way? And they'll say, oh, it's the Health Code 2009 or the Police Powers Responsibility Act 2004, whatever it is. And you say, well, that's an act, right? And they go, yeah. And then you say, well, look, am I a man? Because you need them to corroborate evidence that you're a man. You need your second witness. They'll say, what do you mean? And say, no, that's a yes or no answer. Am I a man? And they'll say, well, yeah, I guess. Or, actually, I'll get to the or afterwards. They'll say, yeah, you're a man. And then you say, great, so we have agreement that I'm a man. So tell me then, how does an act apply to a man? And that's a question they can't answer. The reason they can't answer that is because, as I said before, all acts, codes and statutes, regulations, anything that's put forward anytime recently that's rushed through parliamentary meetings and all that, they apply only to persons. A person being a creature of statute, a dead entity, a non-living entity. So it does not apply to us if we are men and women. And if you can get them to admit that, or to admit that they can't answer the questions, then that's an automatic win in commerce for you. The other side of that, which I was stopped myself earlier just to save confusion, is that if they don't answer or they say no, now anybody who makes a claim, the burden of proof lies on the one making the claim. That's a maxim of law. So if somebody says no, you're not a man, you say, really? Wow, okay, well, do you have some evidence for that then? Because whoever makes the claim, they have to back that up. They can't provide evidence that you're not a man. So they will lose by default. First of all, either by not backing up their claim with evidence or remaining silent then. If they just shut up there and you say, well, hang on, I asked you, so for the second time, do you have some evidence? So whatever the question is, you need to ask them 3 times. If they do not reply after being asked 3 times, then that is their assent. And an assent in legal terms means an unconscious decision to agree. And if they don't answer, you can answer for them. So it's probably going through a lot of little things in a row for people to maybe keep up with, but it's essentially just making sure that you are holding your position as a man or a woman. And if anybody questions that, they must provide evidence. And as a man or a woman, you're always asking the questions. You're not answering other people's questions.
Well, I got to ask a question then, because we've covered so many different ideas, like when people get pulled into a normal court for a traffic ticket or whatever. Mm-hmm. How come everyone doesn't just walk in and say to the so-called judge, am I a man? Wouldn't that stop the whole thing?
Yeah, well, it can. It does. It does when used right. So there's a few in a courtroom. First of all, a court is not a level playing field. You're usually best not to go to court. So if you're offered a traffic, I'm not sure if the States is the same, but in Australia, 90% of court issues are traffic issues. And traffic in our country and yours too are criminal offences. They're not civil. So if you walk in, I'll back up. Instead of going to court, the best thing to do if you're offered a ticket is to ask for proof of claim. So you can put in a private administration process, which means that if they can't provide their source of authority to issue fines, if they can't provide the fact that they have any authority over you whatsoever, then that goes in as a default judgment in your favor. So that might not wipe the fine out. It can, but it might not always. So all you need to do then, instead of actually going into a courtroom and being in front of a judge, you can go into the registrar at a court with 3 unanswered notices with an affidavit in support, and then they can actually put through a court order in your favor, because in commerce, you are the creditor then and you have won. So you don't even need to get in front of a judge. But let's say people are a bit new and they go to court. So again, remembering that everything is an offer. When you get up in front of the judge, they'll ask you your name. They'll say, are you Mr. Tom Barnett? They always say, are you Mr. or Mrs. or Miss, whatever, because what they're trying to do is get you to enter into what's called joinder. And that is you agreeing to be surety for the name that they are calling out. So remember, nobody can put a piece of paper in jail or fine a piece of paper. They need the living being that's associated with it to either provide the labor, to provide money to give to the court or the system, or they need a living being to put into jail. But because nobody has rights over a living being, they need to get you to engage in joinder with the legal name, which is a fictional, that's an entity, it's fictional. So they need to join the two. So what you can do when you go into a courtroom is there's a number of things you can do, but you can, first of all, enter your non-consent. So when they say, are you Mr. Tom Barnett, for example, you say, well, Your Honor, out of necessity, I answer to that name, but in doing so, I reserve my rights and I waive all benefits and privileges. I'm only here under duress and threats of menace. I do not consent to the proceedings. I do not consent to doing business with the prosecutor and the informant. I believe that I've done no wrong. Is there any other business before the court here today, Your Honor? And then what will happen is they'll probably start trying to go again, and you'll probably have to do that 3 times. What generally happens, this is in a mention when you have to put in your plea, guilty, not guilty. So this is before that even gets underway. As soon as you start talking, you have the floor, they cannot interrupt. So you need to go through your non-consent process. You'll likely have to do it 3 times. Sometimes they'll throw you out then. Sometimes they'll say, well, I'm going to adjourn this and come back at 2 o'clock. Then you'll have to go back at 2 o'clock and you'll have to do the whole thing again. And then they'll say, well, look, I've had a chat with the prosecutor over lunch, which they didn't. But they'll say, well, we think that, there's nothing here to support, so you're free to go. So you'll get off on a non-consent process. Every single time I've seen people do that, it's worked every time.
But, all these things take a lot of time out of your life. They're basically just, is there no remedy for that? Can't you turn around and say, okay, I was here for no good reason and you just wasted 7, 8, 9, 10 hours of my life?
Yep, you sure can. But you need to establish that at the start. So for example, I recently sued and won a state government department, and I'm currently suing 2 police officers, and I'm also suing 2 debt collection agencies. So you need to be able to establish things at the beginning. I'll state right now, though, that although I've learned about my rights, I have not necessarily enjoyed it. I would much rather have been surfing, doing something productive, being creative. I do not enjoy it. I actually resent the fact that I have had to spend the amount of time and money that I have in learning this, because it's not something that I want to do. I don't want to be forced into somebody else's game only in order to get off on a technicality and, you didn't put your foot over the line, or you didn't touch the net with your hand or whatever. That's all. I don't know if you can swear on your show. So that's all. I don't like that. I'm not into that at all. And I actually resent having to do that. So yes, the first thing that I do is I say to people, look, not in these words, but what I'm essentially saying is, if you want to force me into a game that I don't want to play in the first place, I am absolutely going to drag you through the mud, and I'm going to make it as difficult as possible for you to, first of all, hold on to your finances, second of all, hold on to your job, and third, keep you out of jail. I will really threaten them at the start, which usually gets them off your back at the beginning. And so you do that by way of notice. So we always need to, when we have intent, we have to notice people with our intent. So for example, with the police officers I dealt with, they wanted to arrest me, and I was saying, well, what are you going to arrest me for? What's the crime here? And they're saying, we need your ID, we need your name. I say, really? Well, would you mind providing me with your identification? We don't have to do that. So would you really? You don't have to. So I just have to give my identification to just anybody. Is that what you're saying? Wouldn't you want to know that somebody is a legitimate policeman before you handed over identification? And they again claimed that they didn't have to. So I said, and they said they were going to arrest me. So I said, well, look, this is your notice that if you do that, that'll be a false arrest, a false detainment. I'll charge you with assault. I'll charge you with breach of civil liberties, breaching the peace. I'll charge you with obstruction, and I'll charge you with personating a police officer, because if you don't show me identification that you are a bona fide police officer, you are personating a police officer. That's a federal offense. You can go to jail for that. And so I was kind of hoping they would. I wasn't putting up much of a fight, so I let them do it. But I noticed them, and they have that on the recording. So I'm using that recording as evidence against them to sue them. So again, that's a little bit too far down the track for most people. But the point is that I noticed them. Once you give somebody your notice, then they are what's called on notice. And if they're on notice, if they do not rebut or respond to in any way your notice, then they are going into commercial default. Once somebody goes into commercial default, there's not many things you can do to get out of commercial default, because as the creditor, the one who noticed the other party, you always come out on top. When you have a private agreement with somebody in under law, there is no law in the land. There's no judge. There is no authoritarian body that can come between an agreement between two people. So what that means is that if you and I have an agreement over something, whether it's financial, an agreement over custody of kids, and it's in writing, there's evidence. If you go into a courtroom, they do not become a judge anymore. They are only then an administrator. And an administrator is there only to adjudicate based on the paperwork. This party here has the paperwork in and an affidavit. This person has no response and no paperwork and no supporting affidavit. As an administrator, I award that matter to party A because they are the only ones with the paperwork in, and everything in the paperwork is in their favor. So as the administrator, I award to them. That's all that they do. They're no longer judges in that capacity.
Well, I'm noticing something here. We've done this a few times, and a lot to do has been made of jurisdiction. Now, I noticed that you outlined very carefully and concisely the realms, private and public, but I notice every time we've talked about the court, you have had zero concern for the jurisdiction of that court.
Yeah, because if you maintain your role as a creditor, you are essentially going in there as a man, and a court does not have authority over a man. Now, there is a case where that applies. If you, let's say, ran over your neighbor with your car or shot somebody, you then come under, in the private, you have breached law. The only two laws essentially being, broadly speaking, love thy neighbor and love thy creator. Those are the only two laws we're bound by. In the public, which is the mirror image, we have all the statutes, codes, and color of law. So in the private realm, there are only two laws. And in the public realm, the mirror image, there are in Australia over 7 million statutes. In the United States, more than 23 million statutes. So that's a lot of different codes and statutes and acts to try to abide by. So if you have harmed people and committed an actual crime in the private, it's, you do come under somebody else's authority then. But even then, you do have a lot up your sleeve. For example, if you apologize, you reset a commercial default. And if you opt to plead and pay and you're being tried for a criminal matter, it turns it into a civil matter. So that then the difference being that you'll still get a financial penalty, but you won't go to jail. That doesn't apply if you murder somebody.
Let's back up a minute. I want to hear about the apology. Can you give an example?
Yeah, so let's say, okay, I'll just preface this with what can go on in a courtroom because you're kind of bringing up courts a lot. My advice is always to stay out of court as much as possible. Try to reach private agreements. We can get into that after we handle this if you want. So as far as being in a courtroom, remember it's not a level playing field. However, if you know who you are and how to handle yourself, you'll do okay. The problem with that is that most judges have the right to test you to see whether you are who you say you are. If you go in there as a creditor and as a man or a woman, they have the right to test you. They want to know that you know who you are. So what they'll do is they'll give you fish hooks. Now, what a fish hook is they might, so Mark, the guy that I learned off from Solutions Empowerment, he's got several, heaps of examples. One is that, I'll use the apology as an example. There was one time when he'd realized he'd said the wrong thing. Now, if you say the wrong thing and you inadvertently put yourself back into a public jurisdiction, or you make a claim and don't back it up, or you somehow put yourself in a difficult position, if you realize you've done that and you go, oh, hang on, I apologize for that, Your Honor, let me rephrase that, and then you say it a better way that doesn't put you in that public realm.
I love that.
That apology, the apology resets the commercial default. That comes from biblical principle. I forget the actual passage, but it says that somebody asked, it was either Peter or Matthew or somebody, they said, how many times do I have to forgive somebody? Is it 7 times? I think it's Peter. He said, no, it's 7 times 70, which essentially just means that if somebody is apologizing to you, you are bound by biblical laws to forgive them. And it doesn't matter how many times, you actually have to always forgive if somebody is genuinely apologizing for a wrongdoing. So if I'd, I'd done something like I'd damaged your driveway or something like that, and I just say, like, Jason or Crow, like, I'm really, really sorry. I apologize for I know that I've done something wrong to you, and I apologize for that. I'm asking for forgiveness, and how can I make it up to you? That kind of thing. Whether you think the Bible is great or not, it's irrelevant, because that's what laws are based on, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about law. So under law, under biblical law, you do have a responsibility to forgive me for that.